Okay, Steve, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Kevin.
Okay, well, we have a real treat for our audience this week. Steve, you're going to be doing an interview with Ben Zuckerman.
I'm excited about that.
And I think as someone who's a fifth generation California who has seen an enormous amount of change in his lifetime, and certainly when you've talked to your predecessor generations growing up, I'm sure they've seen a lot of change. And, you know, Ben is a professor emeritus at UCLA. He's a professor of astronomy and physics. And he's also sits on the board. He's the vice president of the California for Population Stabilization.
Okay.
And Dr. Zuckerman has been very involved when you're looking at the environment, particularly looking at it through that lens of population and the impact that the numbers are having on all these changes. So
you mean there is a number? I can't just conserve my way out of ecological damage?
We might even be beyond that point. I hope we're not. But again, really excited about this interview, Steve, and this will be great. And I'm sure our audience is going to love it as well.
Okay. Good morning, Dr. Zuckerman.
Hi, Steve. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. So you've been a California resident for a long time, about 30 years?
Yeah, I moved here permanently in 1983, although I had spent a fair number of years before that, going all the way back to the summer of 1963.
Okay, so you were a visitor to California first, and then you became a permanent resident
Correct.
citizen.
Yes.
Okay, and you're an astronomer and a physicist. How did you get involved in the issue of population growth?
Well, way back in the 1950s, when I was a teenager, I became aware of the fact that American women, on average, were having 3.5 or 4 babies. And because I sort of was comfortable with doing mathematics, I sort of figured out what this high fertility might imply for the U.S. population or U.S. population growth. And it was clear that if we continued with such high fertility here in the U.S., that the U.S. population would explode. And so I became concerned about it because even back when I was a youth, I thought there were enough people here in the United States, it was crowded enough, and that we should care about leaving space for other species to exist. So I became concerned.
So you were an environmentalist even back then also?
I was an environmentalist of sorts. I really loved animals right from the get-go.
Okay.
But actually in the 1950s and 60s, the two big issues that my generation were concerned with were civil rights and peace, in particular the war in Vietnam. And so for quite a few years, my main focus was on civil rights and on getting out of the war in Vietnam, and I didn't really become a serious environmentalist or conservationist until quite a few years later.
How is it that we've got all this population growth and we keep being told we need, to build more housing to make it affordable, but we've doubled the housing stock in Los Angeles County in my lifetime, and it's less affordable to working people now than it ever was. How does that happen? What are the mechanisms for that?
Well, I think you'd have to ask an urban planner or an economist that question.
Well, those are dark
sure
sciences.
I'm not sure. Yes, I'm not sure I can tell you the reasons for such problems, but I'm a little bit familiar with some of the problems themselves now rather than their past history. For example, just within the last week or two, I attended a class in urban planning in our public affairs building on the UCLA campus, and there, I don't know, maybe 50 people or so in the room between the students and various interested people like myself who weren't students but were there because they had some guest lecturers who were experts on environmental justice issues and affordable housing, and it was very interesting discussion in various ways. one of the problems is because LA is so heavily developed, I think it's true that there's less sort of parkland or less parkland per capita in Los Angeles than any major city in the United States.
That's been true for 30
Yeah,
years.
okay. So there's so little open space that if the population of Los Angeles city or county grows, which it's been doing for decades and decades, and new people are coming in and there's no open space, what happens? What does one do to accommodate these people who are coming into the city, many of whom may not have a lot of money and need some kind of affordable housing? Well, one of the obvious places to put new arrivals, people coming into Los Angeles, would be in some undesirable area, like, for example, alongside of a freeway, which, and there are some open spaces alongside of freeways. However, one really doesn't want to live in these places because the pollution from the freeway is really detrimental to people's health. There have been studies that show, especially for children, I believe also for older people, that you just don't want to live within a few hundred yards of a freeway. And yet, if you build something there, because most people don't want to live there, you could call this affordable housing and put a lot of people in these ones. And one of the things that was mentioned at this class I went to just within the last week or two, that one of the persons in one of the Los Angeles agencies that determines, that works on affordable housing, was asked the question, if there was the choice between not building affordable housing or building affordable housing near freeways, what would you do? Okay? The choice was, would you rather have no affordable housing, or would you rather build affordable housing alongside of freeways? And the person thought about his or her answer, and the answer was, we'll build the affordable housing along the side of freeways. And that just shows how desperate things are now. The thing is, many poor people and people of color live in areas near freeways or near polluting facilities, and this is regarded justifiably so as environmental injustice. But there's the chicken and egg question, and it's one thing if the freeway is already there and the agency decides to put affordable housing next to the freeway. I mean, we're really in a bad way if that's the kind of planning decisions that our overpopulation is forcing upon us. And when I raised in the Q&A portion of this class the question of population growth and saying Los Angeles population's been growing, so we have no open spaces, this must be a forcing issue. This must be a population growth must be one of the causes of environmental injustice. If you're forced, because the population is going to put people in, to make people live in unhealthy environments, then population growth is a cause of environmental injustice. And then I asked the 50 people or so in the room, do you know what the population growth is in Los Angeles over the last, I said I was no expert on this, and what's the population growth been in the last 10 or 20 or 30 years? Not one single person, including the experts, and these are all students, not one single person in that room could answer that question I posed to the room. And it shows that somehow the concept of population growth affecting not only other species, but causing environmental injustice to poor people or people of color of our own species, they don't make the connection that you just can't keep jamming people into a space without causing things like environmental injustice.
And you'd think that a school of urban planning would have that.
Absolutely. Nobody in that room knew about what Los Angeles population growth, because they hadn't connected the two. They hadn't connected the fact that the population's growing, new people are coming in, many are poor, many are people of color. Where are you going to put them? Well, you've got to put them in these places which are still undeveloped, which are undesirable places to live.
And amazingly, I mean, the UCLA School of Urban Planning is considered one of the top 3 in the country. And, you know, once again, these issues were very common in the 1970s. They were things that we considered in the 1970s. And they've fallen off
The radar screen.
They're off the radar screen. They're off the map. I was in a situation recently in a group discussion on several issues where I raised the idea of population control, and people on the left, I'm not control, but I mean voluntary limiting population, not like state control. And I mean, people on the left and people on the right started screaming. It was the only thing they were ever unified on in this group was, how dare I even mention this concept. And, you know, I was on the way to where we are today, and I was on the 2 freeway, and there's a section of the 2 freeway that's where the Los Angeles River goes underneath it. And the Los Angeles River, for those of you not from LA, is a big ditch. Okay, there's no like scenic river there. It's a big concrete ditch. Right. And it generally has a lot of polluted outfall from it because there's a lot of little industrial nooks there, and there's a lot of power plants along the river. And they were building this hyper-dense apartment structure next to the 2 freeway and on the edge of the Los Angeles River. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God. And UCLA did do a study, because I was in meetings in the city of Los Angeles. They did a study about 5 years ago where they were recommending that no units be built within 1,000 feet of a freeway because high incidence of cancer, high incidence of emphysema, high incidence of leukemia, all from apartment buildings and houses that are within 1,000 feet of a freeway. So the science is known. We know that putting those things there leads to significant health issues that lead to early death. And we're just shoving the things in there because we've got to keep making room. But so there's really 3 methods for population control as far as I can see. There's government force, there's education of the population, and then a third one, which is kind of a political hot potato, is immigration control. Because, I mean, the leading cause of population growth in Europe and in California seems to be immigration. How do we address that? Or can we address that?
Well, once upon a time when the leading cause of population growth in the United States was high fertility of American women, which is what I mentioned earlier, was what I first noticed back in the 1950s and 60s. The most controversial aspect of trying to lower fertilities was the question of abortion, because they're related, although nobody I've ever known has argued that abortion should be a major aspect of birth control or fertility control or anything like that. But, you know, there is some relationship between fertility, how many children a woman has, and whether or not abortions are legal, for example. So there was this conflict that went on for quite a few years in the United States, but ultimately was won in the sense that that people lowered their fertility and abortion was made more or less legal. That's still the situation. It's still a contentious issue. But it was one that one could at least deal with at some level. Once the primary cause of U.S. population growth shifted from high fertility of American women to immigration and the U.S.-born children of immigrants, then it became absolutely radioactive, and words like racism and xenophobia became popular as ways to demonize people who thought that immigration levels to the United States should be reduced. And that's pretty much where we stand now. People, both on the right and on the left, have issues with controlling immigration, and so it's just so politically radioactive that it's literally impossible to deal with. We know right now what's going on is there's this enormous immigration battle in Congress going on as we speak.
Do you think in part it's, or a major root of this is the nature of capitalism, which demands continuous growth from industry and the economy?
Yeah, I do. As I've thought about these kind of issues more and more over the years, I don't see how a system of capitalism such as exists now in the United States and in most of the world, I would say, at least most of the industrialized world, can be compatible with a world that has more than 7 billion on the way to 9 or 10 or 11 billion, depending on whose projections one believes or prefers. I just don't see any way that our current system of resource consumption and pollution and whatnot can lead to anything but disasters and catastrophe, given how many people there are in the world. Way back many years ago, I wrote an op-ed piece for the Los Angeles, that was published in the Los Angeles Times, and the last few sentences in that opinion piece basically said, I think a world with many fewer people, each one of whom can have a reasonable level of consumption, be way preferable to the world that we now live in, and it's going to get worse, where there are just billions of people living at the verge of starvation levels, and it's just somehow human beings are going to have to find a way to reduce our numbers so that consumption levels can be reasonable. Unfortunately, I think that we're not going to stabilize our population in any kind of a rational way, or a combination of our consumption and our population. And so some unpleasant things are on the horizon, I think. But capitalism is definitely part of the problem. And there are a couple of books that have come out recently which recognize that there is an issue with capitalism, and the fact that it requires constant growth of a few percent per year in order to stay healthy, and something's going to have to change.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having
Great
me.
discussion.